If you've ever been told you're strong, when what they really meant was you'll manage without us, then you'll understand this story. Before I begin, comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far this reaches. Because what happened to me didn't happen quietly. It happened in front of everyone. There were 18 people in the room the night my father erased me. 18. I know because I counted them later. I replayed that moment so many times that every face is still clear in my mind. It was my Aunt Catherine's birthday dinner. Early October. Cold outside, warm inside. Her house smelled like roasted garlic and red wine. The windows were fogged from the oven heat. Laughter bounced off the kitchen tiles. It felt safe, normal, predictable. And then my father stood up. He didn't tap his glass. He didn't clear his throat. He just stood. And when he stood, the room shifted automatically. Conversation slowed. Forks paused midair. That's what authority looks like when you've grown up around it. I've been thinking about the future, he began. His voice was calm, controlled, almost thoughtful. I've updated my estate plan. I remember my mother stiffening slightly in her chair. My younger brother, Evan, leaned back casually, completely relaxed. I believe in transparency. Dad continued, so there won't be confusion later. And then he did something deliberate. He placed his hand firmly on Evan's shoulder. The house, the lake property, the business, all of it will go to Evan. A subtle murmur moved around the table. Not loud, just enough. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react. And then he looked at me. And Claire has her own life. She's independent. She doesn't need anything from me. Independent. He said it like a compliment. But everyone in that room knew what it really meant. It meant, you're not chosen, you're not prioritized, you're not included. I smiled politely, I nodded once, and I took a sip of water like nothing had shifted. But something had, permanently. For context, I'm 35 years old. I live in Chicago. I work in corporate risk analysis for a national supply chain firm. I pay my own mortgage. I built my own savings. I've never asked my parents for money since I graduated college. Evan is 32. He works at my father's construction company. Works is generous. He has a title, operations director, but he shows up when he wants, leaves when he wants, and still drives a brand new truck every year. Growing up, Evan was magnetic, outgoing, confident, charismatic. I was steady, organized, responsible. When bills needed sorting, I did it. When mom forgot passwords, I fixed them. When dad needed spreadsheets organized at 16, I built them. But Evan was the future. I was the reliable one. If you're the reliable one in your family, type reliable in the comments. Because you already know how this goes. Reliable children don't get rescued. They get expected. After dinner, as people were putting coats on and saying their goodbyes, my cousin leaned in close to me. Are you okay? She whispered. I smiled. Of course. I've always been good at that smile. The one that says, I'm fine. I'm composed. Nothing touches me. Evan texted me later that night. Don't take it personally. You left. That sentence stayed with me. You left. Yes, I left at 23 because I didn't want my career decided at the family table, because I didn't want my paycheck tied to my father's mood, because I wanted independence to mean freedom, not punishment. And somehow, that became betrayal. 3 days later, my father called. Stop by the office tomorrow, he said. There's paperwork. Paperwork. That word again. His office hasn't changed since I was 12. Same worn leather chair, same wooden desk, same faint smell of sawdust and coffee. He slid a document across the desk toward me. I need you to sign this acknowledgement, he said calmly. I read it. It was formal. If I signed it, I would waive my right to contest his will after his death. I'm not signing this, I said evenly. Evan, sitting on the couch scrolling his phone, looked up. Why are you being dramatic? I'm not. Dad leaned back. It's my money. I know. Then what's the problem? The problem, I replied calmly, is that you're asking me to give up legal rights for no reason. Don't make this ugly, he said quietly. That sentence stayed with me, because when someone says that, it usually means they're afraid it already is. That night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't greed. It was timing. Why formalize my silence now? Why rush paperwork? Why the urgency? Something didn't align. And I've built a career on recognizing misalignment. So I did what I do professionally. I started asking questions. Quietly. If you've ever been told to just trust us when documents are involved, Pause before you ever do. Trust without transparency is leverage. The next morning, I pulled up public business filings for my father's company. Revenue looked stable. Expansion looked aggressive. 3 new equipment purchases in 2 years. A second property acquired. An expanded credit line. Expansion isn't bad, but expansion with debt requires stability. And that's when I remembered something. 5 years ago, during a rough quarter, Dad had asked me to co-sign a business credit extension. It's temporary, he said at the time, just until contracts clear. I trusted him. I signed, and I never thought about it again. Until that moment, I went cold, because if that guarantee was still active, and debt had increased, then cutting me out of ownership while keeping me tied to liability would be strategic, not emotional. Strategic. The next day, I called a corporate attorney, not to fight, to understand. Are you financially connected to the company? She asked. Yes, I replied quietly, and that one word changed everything. She reviewed the original documentation. My name was still listed as a personal guarantor on a significant line of credit. Claire, she said carefully, if the company defaults, creditors can pursue you. Silence. My father had publicly erased me from inheritance, but privately, I was still attached to risk. If you're still here, comment, fine print, because this is where everything begins. I didn't confront him immediately. I requested updated financial documentation formally. That's when the temperature changed. Dad called within hours. You're accusing me of something? No. You don't trust your own father? This isn't about trust. It sounds like it is. No. I replied calmly. It's about exposure. Silence. Then, you're unbelievable. No, I said evenly. I'm cautious. The documents arrived 2 weeks later, and they told a different story than Sunday dinners did. Spending had increased significantly. Evan had access to discretionary funds, high-end client entertainment, travel expenses, a leased vehicle categorized under business development. Nothing illegal, but reckless. And the company's debt ratio had tightened. If revenue dipped even slightly, the bank would reassess. And if they reassessed, they could call in guarantors. Me, I wasn't in the will, but I was still in the liability. That wasn't favoritism. That was insulation. I sat in my kitchen staring at spreadsheets for hours. Not crying, not angry, just clear, crystal clear. He wasn't just choosing Evan. He was protecting Evan by keeping me as backup. That realization hurt more than the will ever could. If you've ever been the stable one in your family, you know this feeling. You're not chosen for reward. You're chosen for responsibility. And sometimes that responsibility isn't even disclosed. The next move I made wasn't emotional. It was strategic. I scheduled a meeting directly with the bank. Professional, neutral, measured. As long as your name remains on the guarantee, you're liable, the representative confirmed. Can I request release? Yes. If the company replaces your guarantee with equivalent collateral. Equivalent collateral. Evan didn't have that credit capacity, which meant my father would have to step in personally. For the first time in my life, my quiet signature had leverage, and I intended to use it. This wasn't about revenge. This was about insulation. If I was going to be cut out publicly, I would not remain exposed privately, and that's when everything started to shift. But what happened next is where the real conflict began. I didn't tell my father immediately. That's the part people always misunderstand. They think confrontation is strength. It's not. Timing is. For 3 days after meeting with the bank, I said nothing. I reviewed every document again, every signature, every clause, every renewal date. The personal guarantee was still active, and it was not small. If the company defaulted, creditors could pursue me personally, my savings, my condo, my future. And suddenly the will announcement didn't feel like favoritism. It felt like positioning. If you remove someone from control but leave them attached to risk, that's not an accident. That's design. I drafted the formal notice with my attorney. It was clean, professional, direct. Unless I was granted full financial transparency and oversight proportional to my liability, I would pursue immediate release from the personal guarantee. Translation: if I carry risk, I carry authority, or I carry nothing at all. I sent it Tuesday at 9:14 a.m. Dad called at 9:22. You've lost your mind. No, you're threatening your own family. I'm protecting myself. You don't trust me? There it was again. Trust. The word people use when they don't want accountability. This isn't about trust. I said calmly. It's about exposure. Silence. Then his tone changed. You're jealous. That one almost made me laugh. Of what? I asked evenly. He didn't answer, because there was nothing to be jealous of. Evan had control. Evan had praise. Evan had public approval. What I had was paperwork, and paperwork doesn't lie. Evan called an hour later. What the hell are you doing? Stabilizing myself. You're humiliating Dad. No, I said. The bank is. You've always thought you were smarter than everyone. That's not the issue. Then what is? The issue, I replied calmly, is that I won't be your backup plan. That was the first moment of silence from him, because he understood, even if he didn't admit it. An emergency meeting was scheduled that Friday, not a family dinner, a corporate meeting. Bank representative, company accountant, my father, Evan, and me. For the first time in my life, I walked into that office not as a daughter, but as a liability holder. The atmosphere was different, tighter, less performative. The banker laid out the situation clearly. Without my personal guarantee, the company's credit profile shifted significantly. They required one of three things. 1. Replacement collateral. 2. Reduced credit limit. 3. Operational restructuring with tighter financial controls. Dad's jaw tightened. Evan shifted in his chair. This is unnecessary, Dad said. The company is stable. The banker nodded politely. On paper, yes. But leverage has increased. Leverage. That word mattered. Expansion funded by debt isn't strength. It's exposure. The accountant passed around updated reports. And for the first time, I saw everything clearly. Discretionary spending had increased by 38% over 2 years. Client entertainment, travel, equipment upgrades that weren't essential. Revenue was stable, but margins were thinner than Dad admitted publicly. And if a single major contract fell through, the bank could reassess, which meant they could call in guarantees, which meant me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I asked one question. If revenue drops 10%, what happens? The accountant hesitated. We would need to restructure debt. And if restructuring fails? Silence. The banker answered instead. Then guarantors are pursued. Dad glared at me. You're acting like we're collapsing. No, I said calmly. I'm acting like numbers matter. That was the moment the room shifted, because this wasn't emotional anymore. It was structural. After the meeting, Dad cornered me in his office. You blindsided me. I asked for transparency. You could have talked to me first. I did, I said quietly. When you asked me to sign away my rights. Silence. His expression flickered. Not guilt. Recognition. That night, my mother called. You're making this worse, she said softly. Worse for who? For your father. And what about me? Silence. Mothers don't like choosing sides, but silence is a side. If you've ever been the stable one in your family, you know this pattern. You're expected to absorb discomfort, to keep the peace, to not rock the boat. But sometimes the boat is already leaking, and you're just the only one checking the water level. The bank gave them 2 weeks to present restructuring options. 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks, the atmosphere changed. Evan stopped texting. Dad stopped calling. My mother became distant. But behind the scenes, pressure was building. The accountant began reviewing discretionary expenses more aggressively. Several large, client charges were flagged. Travel that didn't match signed contracts. Vehicle expenses exceeding projections. Consulting invoices without detailed breakdowns. Nothing illegal, but careless. And carelessness under leverage is dangerous. Flashback. When we were teenagers, Evan once maxed out a credit card Dad gave him for emergencies. He bought a stereo system. Dad paid it off quietly. No harm done, he said at the time. That moment replayed in my mind, because that pattern never changed. Evan made decisions. Dad absorbed consequences. But now the consequences weren't small. They were 6 figures, and my name was on the line. The second meeting with the bank was colder, more direct. They had run updated risk assessments. Without my guarantee, credit limits would be reduced by 25%. Operational oversight would increase. Quarterly reporting required, and discretionary accounts frozen pending review. Evan snapped. This is ridiculous. We're not criminals. No one said you were, the banker replied calmly. This is risk mitigation. Risk mitigation. That's what I do for a living. I assess exposure. I reduce volatility. I protect downside. And now I was doing it for myself. After the meeting, Evan followed me to the parking lot. You're enjoying this? No. You've always resented me. That That's not true. You left. You didn't want to be part of this. I didn't want to depend on this. There's a difference. He didn't understand that, because dependence had always worked in his favor. Over the next month, restructuring began. Budgets were capped. Spending approvals required dual signatures. Client entertainment limits reduced. Equipment purchases paused. Evan's access was restricted. He hated it. Dad hated it. But the bank required it. And slowly, something unexpected happened. The company stabilized. Margins improved. Cash flow tightened. Waste reduced. It turned out discipline wasn't sabotage. It was structure. But that didn't fix the family fracture. Sunday dinners stopped. Group chats went quiet. My mother sent shorter messages. And for the first time in my life, I felt like an outsider, not just publicly, but emotionally. That part hurt more than the paperwork. If you're still here, comment boundaries, because that's what this really is. Not revenge, not competition, boundaries. 6 weeks after the initial notice, I received official documentation. The company had secured additional collateral through property refinancing. My personal guarantee was being formally released. Signed, filed, legally binding. I read the document 3 times. Then I exhaled. Not victory, relief, because I was no longer someone else's insurance policy. But something else shifted too. Without my silent backup, the company had to operate realistically. Evan had to justify expenses. Dad had to answer to lenders. Decisions required scrutiny, and scrutiny creates accountability, even when it's uncomfortable. 2 months later, Dad called. His voice was different, less sharp. I updated the will, he said. I didn't respond immediately. You're listed as equal beneficiary. Silence. Why? I asked calmly. He hesitated. Because you're the only one who asked questions. That wasn't warmth, but it was recognition. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened next wasn't about the will. It was about something much deeper, something that changed the dynamic between all of us permanently. And it started the night Evan showed up at my condo unannounced, and said something I didn't expect. Evan showed up at my condo on a Thursday night. No warning, no text, no performance. Just a knock. When I opened the door, he didn't look angry. He looked tired. You busy? He asked. That alone told me something had shifted. Evan doesn't ask. He declares. I stepped aside and let him in. He didn't sit right away. He stood in the middle of my living room like he wasn't sure where he fit. You really would have let it collapse, he said finally. No. I replied calmly. I would have let it operate honestly. He looked at me for a long time. You think I can't handle it? That's not what I think. Then what do you think? I didn't answer immediately, because honesty changes things. I think Dad never let you handle consequences, I said quietly. That landed harder than anything else I'd said in months. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He just exhaled. You blindsided us, he said. No, I replied. I stopped protecting you without knowing I was. Silence filled the room. And for the first time in our lives, there wasn't competition between us. There was clarity. If you've ever had that moment with a sibling, the moment where childhood patterns collide with adult reality, you know how heavy it feels. It's not dramatic. It's sobering. Evan sat down finally. I didn't know your name was still on that line of credit, he said. I believed him. That was the part that stung. Dad hadn't even told him. You were protected, I said evenly. From risk, from consequences, from everything. And you weren't? No. He nodded slowly. I thought you left because you didn't care. I left because I didn't want to depend. That was the difference neither of us understood growing up. To him, staying meant loyalty. To me, leaving meant survival. We talked for almost 2 hours. Not about the will. Not about money. About childhood. About the pressure he felt to become the successor. About the way Dad compared us constantly. About the way I was labeled strong, and therefore didn't get softness. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. And honesty rearranges families quietly. A week later, everything changed again. Dad collapsed at work. Not catastrophic. Not fatal. But serious enough to require emergency surgery. And in moments like that, ego disappears fast. Evan called me immediately. Not mom. Not extended family. Me. What do we do? The shift was complete. At the hospital, Dad looked smaller. Authority Humanity shrinks under fluorescent lights. Machines don't care about legacy, or wills, or favoritism. They care about heart rhythm. For the first time, I didn't see my father as a force. I saw him as human, and something softened, not erased, not forgotten, softened. The doctors said he would recover, but recovery requires delegation, and delegation requires trust. The company needed oversight immediately. Contracts had to be reviewed, payroll maintained, lenders updated. Evan looked overwhelmed, and in that hallway, something irreversible happened. He asked for my help, not reluctantly, directly. I can't do this alone. That sentence mattered more than the will ever did. If you're still here, comment shift, because this is where power really changes. I didn't step in as a hero. I stepped in as structure. We divided responsibilities. Evan handled field operations. I handled financial oversight, not because I wanted control, because someone had to read the numbers carefully. For the first time in our lives, we operated as equals, not in affection, in accountability. During Dad's recovery, I found something in his office, a folder labeled estate draft. It wasn't finalized, but it was clear. The original will, the one announced publicly, was drafted months before the company expanded aggressively, before debt increased, before leverage tightened. Back then, the company looked unstoppable. Expansion felt like success, but expansion funded by optimism isn't stability, it's exposure. And I realized something that shifted my anger into something more complex. Dad didn't cut me out to hurt me. He cut me out because he thought he was protecting me from responsibility. He just didn't realize he'd already tied me to it. That's the difference between intention and impact. And families live in that gap. When Dad came home, thinner and quieter, the atmosphere was different. Authority had been humbled, and humility changes tone. One evening, he called me into his study. No announcements, no audience. I was wrong, he said, not loudly, not dramatically, simply, I should have told you about the credit line renewal. Yes, I replied, and I shouldn't have made that announcement publicly. No, I said calmly, you shouldn't have. Silence. You embarrassed me. You exposed me. I answered. That was the first real confrontation. No yelling, no theatrics, just truth. He looked at me differently after that. Not as the independent daughter, not as the one who left, but as someone who saw risk before it exploded. And for a man who built everything from scratch, that mattered. The will was rewritten formally. Equal distribution, clear language, no public announcement this time, just documentation. But here's what's important. By the time it was rewritten, it didn't matter as much. Because the real shift wasn't inheritance, it was structure. The company became disciplined, spending monitored, debt reduced steadily over a year, margins improved, not because Evan became someone new overnight, but because systems replaced ego, and systems protect families better than favoritism ever does. A year later, Sunday dinners resumed, quieter, less performative. Evan still jokes, Dad still leads conversations, but something subtle changed. When financial topics come up, they look at me, not dismissively, deliberately. Respect doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives with acknowledgement. If you've ever been underestimated in your own family, hear this clearly. You don't need to scream to shift power. You need boundaries, documentation, and the courage to stand still when pressure tries to move you. I was called independent like it meant unnecessary, but independence isn't isolation. It's insulation. It's the ability to survive even when systems around you fail. And sometimes, that insulation saves everyone, even the people who tried to exclude you. The will still exists, but the real inheritance wasn't money. It was clarity. It was balance. It was understanding that love without accountability creates chaos, and accountability without love creates resentment. Families survive somewhere in between. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you've ever been the reliable one, the smart one, the independent one, comment steady, because steady wins long term. My father tried to simplify the future by choosing one successor, but life isn't simple. Business isn't simple. Families aren't simple. He thought cutting me out would reduce conflict. Instead, it forced growth. And growth is uncomfortable, but it's better than collapse. I didn't fight for inheritance. I fought for insulation. I didn't demand recognition. I demanded transparency. And in the end, that changed everything. If this story resonated with you, subscribe. There are more stories like this. Stories about boundaries, about quiet power, about strategic strength. Because sometimes the loudest move you can make is simply refusing to sign.